Morning, folks. I'm Dave Canterbury with Suffolk Alliance Outfitters in the Pathfinder School. Obviously out here at the school property underneath the classroom overhang at the Pathfinder School. And what I thought I would do today is I've got a book that I'm in the middle of right now, in the middle of writing. And the manuscript is due here in about 15 days. But it's an illustrated book about bushcraft, and it's going to have lots and lots of illustrations within that book. And one of the things that I wanted to strive for with this book was to have several illustrations created that really aren't out there the way I think they should be illustrated. There's lots and lots of bow drill illustrations out there that are just one picture of the guy over the top of the set, or maybe a picture of a few components, but there's really nothing that shows how that set should actually look, with up close pictures of things like the notch, the underside of the board, the thickness of the board, all those types of things come into play. But again, they're all also material dependent. And that's the hardest thing about teaching the bow drill to a mass audience like on the internet, because there's so many different materials out there. Some of them work way better than others. Some of them you can almost get a coal out of by accident as long as they're dry. Cedars are a good example of that. Cedar is a very, very easy wood to get a bow drill ember off of. And then if you go out west, of course, where most people practice the hand drill, it's because everything out there is so dry, and it's easier to get an ember with a hand drill out there. It can be done in eastern woodlands, but the fact that you have mechanical advantage with the bow drill, and you can overcome some of the humidity factors and moisture factors in the eastern woodlands, makes the bow drill a better option, I think, for people to learn in the eastern woodlands. However, like I said, there's not a whole lot of comprehensive photographs or images or illustrations out there of exactly how to do that. So I thought what I'd do today is, to make a long story short, while I am setting this bow drill set up to take photographs, I thought I would also try to shoot some short video to kind of show you up close what some of those components are supposed to look like. And then we'll go ahead and make an ember with this set. Stay with me. Okay, so I just split a poplar log, and you can see this pith line running through the middle. And then you can see the heartwood separated from the sapwood. The more of this sapwood I can get to use in my bow drill set, the better off it's going to be. As I get closer and closer to the pith or the dead wood, the more dense the material is going to be, other than the pith itself. So this area of yellow and kind of a purplish heartwood here is going to be dense compared to this outer white wood. So if I can find a piece of that white wood that's wide enough to get my bow drill into, even if I'm just touching this green, that's okay. But I don't want to make it in this area. I want it over here. So I have to think about that when I'm making my board to begin with. And I want that board to be about the thickness of my finger when it's finished. Okay, this is the center of that log. You have this on one side and this on the other side. And this is the center. So this is what I'm going to use for my hearth board. You can see I've got plenty of white wood there. All right. So I get my spindle out of one of these two by splitting it again. Okay, I've cleaned up the outer side. Again, I want to stay in the white wood, and I've picked a good wide spot of that white wood right here. So this is going to be my board, and it's about thumb, a little over finger thick. And this length is good because it gives me a lot of options down the road, as long as I can keep this thing dry. Okay, now we have split one side of that log off, and we're going to use one of these two to create our spindle. Okay, so I decided the length that I wanted my spindle to be, and generally, you know, something like that is about what I start with. It's easier to remove the bulk of the waste material with an axe, then go back in and refine it with your knife. Now, as I begin to refine the shape of this spindle, I want to keep it straight. I don't want that thing to have a hook in it, or it's going to wobble when I'm drilling with it. So I got to keep it straight. The next thing I want to think about is, how big do I want this thing to end up? And for me, in the eastern woodlands, with the material that I generally use, which is tulip poplar, because I'm pretty shy on cedar out here. For tulip poplar, I like to have that spindle about the size of my thumb in diameter or just a little bit bigger. And again, you know, about this big. Okay, so here's what I tell my students when they're making a bow drill spindle for the first time. I tell them to make that spindle look like the pencil you had when you were in about 4th grade and you've been chewing on the eraser all day long and you're about ready to take it to the pencil sharpener because it was getting dull. So you've got a very dull point, but a definite point on the top of that spindle. That's going to rest in the bearing block. And then you've got kind of a chamfered and bull-nosed front end on this thing that looks like a chewed on eraser. Okay, the next thing we're going to work on is we're going to work on our handhold or our bearing block. And believe it or not, that's the place that causes the most problems in a bow drill set. You don't want any friction in that bearing block because you want all the friction down below. If you have friction at the top and you start to waller out that bearing block and it starts to what's called shoulder out, where it's rubbing on the sides of the hole that you've created for your bearing block or the divot, it's going to become harder to be able to push that bow back and forth to rotate that spindle. The easier that spindle moves, the better you're going to be at making a bow drill ember. Now you can get commercial handholds like this Pathfinder fire tool, or you can make a handhold. I made this one out of antler this morning really quick, and it's just a piece of antler tine that's comfortable in my hand to hold, and I just drilled a small divot in it with a large drill bit, and then I drilled a hole straight through it right here for a lanyard. But that will work just fine as well. And you could make this on the fly in the bush if you needed to by carving that out with your knife point. It would work the same way. And you can burn these antler tines off if you find a shed in the woods just by holding a hot coal up to them for a while and then snapping them off. I've got video on that on my channel. So this is something you can make in the bush. This is something you would have to carry in with you for practicing the bow drill. But again, this is going to make it seem easy compared to what it really is sometimes, because a wooden handhold is much more difficult. And that's what we're going to make right now. Now I should mention in this video that you could also find a stone that already had an indentation in it or a groove in it that you could use for a handhold. I see lots of people doing that, and that'll work as well. And there's lots of fancy tricks that you can use, you know, shot glasses and skateboard wheels and bearings and all those kind of things, but none of that is truly bushcraft. To me, if it's not made out of a piece of natural material like antler or wood, it's really not truly bushcraft. But then again, you go all the way back to, is your cordage natural material on your bow itself? Is that really bushcraft? I think primitive fire is an important skill to understand, not because it's going to save your life, but because it teaches you a lot of mechanics and a lot of understanding variability within a process. So what I've got here is a piece of hardwood, and it's pretty damp. That's an advantage to me because I'm going to get less burning of that handhold. And what I'm going to do is, this thing is about 2.5 inches, something like that, in diameter. I'm going to cut this off to about the width of my hand, and then we're going to split it in half. Okay, so I've taken a piece of that wood and cut it off, and I've split it just on one side of the heartwood. You can see this is the side I would choose. I want that heartwood so it's really nice and hard. Now, this is a green piece of wood and it's damp, so this thing's going to be great for a handhold. Again, back to that whole thing of you know, what is bushcraft? Well, to me, anytime you have to craft something in the woods to make something work, even if it's just part of the bow drill set, maybe you bring in the handhold, maybe you brought in cordage, but you have to erect the rest of the set from natural material, that is bushcrafting. Anything else beyond that is primitive wilderness living skills. And right now we're talking about bushcraft. Okay, so I've taken that piece and I've chamfered the edges so it's more comfortable in my hand. And I've just dug out a little area in the center with my knife point. Just going in there and trimming the fibers just like this to cut that hole in there. Now you don't want to get that too deep because it's going to burn in. And generally what I'll do is I'll take this and just kind of twist it in there a few times to kind of marry those up. I'll do the same thing on my fireboard here in a little bit and you'll see what I'm talking about. All right, just like that. Now we're ready to go. Okay, so to the bow part of this, I like to find something that's got a fork in the top that is fairly long, green. It doesn't matter if it's got a bow in it. If it's straight, it's fine. We're going to clean this up, get all the branches and stuff off of it, cut it to length, and then we'll talk about it some more. Okay, don't overcomplicate this part of the process. Clean the knots off of it, make sure that they're level so you don't get any humps and bumps in there, because your spindle will be on the outside of your string anyway, so it's not going to rub up against this. But you don't want anything rough on there either necessarily. I like to have this thing about the length of my outstretched arm with my cupped hand in my armpit. That gives me a good length. The biggest mistakes I see with bows when it comes to students is too fat or too short. You want this thing plenty long, because the more stroke you can get out of this thing, it's just like a saw. The more stroke you get, the more revolutions you get of that spindle with a single stroke. That's important. The other thing is, you don't want this thing heavy, because you may be going out this for a little while. So if you're going at it and this thing's heavy, it's going to wear you out. So you want this thing nice and light, but nice and sturdy. A good green, heavy branch will work fine for this. Okay, let's talk about setting up this bow for a minute. Now, you can see I've got a fork on the front of this bow, and I like that for a reason. I'll show you that in just a minute. It doesn't matter if you're using like hickory bass cordage like this, or if you're using that utility cord you had in your pocket that I showed you yesterday on the tree when we hung our pack, that 6-foot piece of paracord, or if you brought a piece of bank line into the woods. So just take that bank line, put a stop knot in one end of it, then come up here and put a bowline knot in that thing. And it doesn't matter what your loop size is, but you can keep the loop size fairly small on this bowline knot. Doesn't have to be really big, okay? Something like that will work just great. Now, I'll just tie a stop knot in the other end of this thing. What that allows is allows me to put that loop over the top and run it right back over the top, just like this, to hold my bowstring. Now all I need to do is cut a quick notch to tie this cord into, and I'm ready to rock and roll. It doesn't have to be fancy. A saw kerf is enough. Look at how your string lays on the bow and how you want it to be. Flip it over to both sides and see which side's better. This side's got a little bit of a bow in it. So what I'm probably going to do is I'm probably going to put my kerf right on the back side here, about right here of that V. Mark that with my thumb, put my kerf in there, and then tie it off. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that our spindle and our bow are ready to rock and roll. So we've got our bow tied up here, and now we want to put our spindle in. Now I'm left-handed, but I always approach the string from the bottom with the working end, where the end is going to go in the board, up and then turn it down. So if I'm right-handed, I'm going to come over here, go behind the string, turn it down, and if your string's tight, you may have to roll it a little bit to get it in there. You kind of want that, to be honest with you. Get a good bite on that thing. I know that's going to go in there, so that's no big deal. I know we're good to go. Now, that's a good tight string, and we're ready to rock and roll with that part. So the next thing we need to do is prepare our board for the burn-in process. Now, this is where a lot of people make a mistake. It really matters a lot where you burn this hole and how this notch is both oriented and constructed in this board. What I tell my students is take the thickness of your spindle and half again, and that's where you want to start your burn-in process. If you're too close to the front of this board, you're going to end up burning into your notch, and you're going to lose a lot of friction against the board, because you're going to have that notch open area where you're not getting any friction of the spindle against material to create an ember. So you want to take this thing and lay it on the board and go halfway back, one roll. So about right there is where I want to create the spot that I'm going to burn in. So when you're cutting that initial divot in there, get that thing on a flat surface, choke up on your knife, and just dig yourself a spot in there. Don't go too deep. It's better if you are scraping across the top to create that divot and moving the workpiece as you go, just like this, and severing those fibers as you go around. It doesn't have to be real deep. Trust me on that. You're dealing with soft wood here. Now what you can do is you can come up here and you can take this and just kind of work it in, just like I did with the handhold, to kind of marry that up and see where you're at. If you don't think you're deep enough at that point, then you can go back and do it again. Okay, the next thing we want to do is we want to, before we cut any notches in this board, we want to ensure that the set's going to work, and that's called the burn-in process. What that does is that tells us exactly where the spindle's going to ride so that we can create our notch in relation to that. And it also gives us an indication of whether this piece of wood is going to work well for us before we put any more work into it, like creating a notch. So just lay it on the ground and get your materials together. We've got our spindle and our bow, and we have our handhold. We'll go ahead and load our spindle. I'm going to load this thing from the left side because I'm used to it. I've already showed you how to do it from the right side. You're better off if that thing is lower on the spindle when you load it up than higher. And when you are rowing this thing, or bowing action is going on here, you've got to keep this bow level. If you turn it up, it's going to ride up the spindle. If you let it droop down, it's going to ride down the spindle. So that part's very important. The next thing that's important is, okay, here's a good point I want to talk to you about real quick. I'm getting ready to put my foot on this board. My foot's probably got mud, moisture, and everything else on it. I could do myself a favor and put another piece of wood on there. And that would be a smart thing to do if I were planning on using this kit very long. Now, I'm going to come in here and hold everything together. And I'm going to lock the crook of my wrist into my shin. And I'm going to move my back leg out of the way. And now what I want to do is I just want to slowly, I don't want to get in a hurry here. I want to put downward pressure on it, get the center of my body, the center of gravity of my body over the top of the spindle so that I don't have to use my arm to put pressure on the spindle. I'm really using my leg by leaning forward. My leg's pushing in on that spindle, pushing down. And then I just want to gently marry the set. And this is my chance really to kind of see what's going on, to make sure that I'm creating what I need to create for material, make sure it's burning in good, make sure my color's right, make sure my handhold is good. Once I get that thing black, I can stop. And now I'm going to inspect the pieces and parts of my set. The first thing I want to look at is, am I shouldering out here? And I can feel a little bit of resistance here. I've been doing it long enough to know that. So that tells me this is already shouldering out in here. This needs to have a little bit steeper point on it. The problem with that is, the steeper this point is, the easier it is to crush it away. So I probably would opt to open this up instead. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is our notch. And this is really, really important. What we want to do first of all is we want the end of that notch to basically just touch or apex right there. And we want it to go out from that like this. Okay? Now, a couple things. Depending on the material that you're using, this notch may need to be bigger or smaller. If you're using a fibrous material like tulip poplar, it may need to be a little bit wider to allow more oxygen into the material. If you're using something that's very dry and very fine dust, then you can get away with a thinner notch, all right? So what we're going to first do is we're going to cut this notch basically just like this with a saw into our board and remove it. And we could use our knife for that or our saw, either one. I find the saw is pretty clean and quick and dirty. Okay, I'm going to show you a little tip or trick real fast here while I'm cutting this notch. You can see that I've cut the notch with a saw. I've kind of left the line there for you to see. But what I did was I back cut it on the other side. So in other words, I made my straight cut and then I tilted the saw a little bit and cut back into it a little further on the back side. So the notch is actually a little deeper on the back side than it is on the front side. And now you can pop that notch out of there with your saw, or you can pop it out of there with your knife. Either way, just pop it straight out. Now you can kind of see how that notch is a little deeper on the back than it is the front. And now you just want to kind of clean that out. Make sure you got a good clean surface there. And I like to cut just a little bit of a recess right there where it marries up to my burn-in, just to give that coal a good place to spill into. And you can see what I've done is I've restricted, yet I've opened up the notch by doing that back cut. And you can see that right here, how there's a little bit of a taper in that notch. I hope you can see that on the camera. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the bottom of the board and I'm going to cut a little bit of a chamfer right in the base of that notch. And what that's going to allow is, it's going to allow, when that board is on the ground flat, it's going to allow a little bit of oxygen flow underneath that notch to the material. And I find that when you're talking about materials like tulip poplar, that extra aeration underneath there makes a big difference because you're talking about a thick fibered material. So the construction of this notch, depending on the material you're using, can be very, very critical. Okay, the next critical step is the creation of our bird nest. And it needs to be made up of coarse, medium, and fine material. What we've got here is a combination of poplar bark and aspen bark, okay? And we're going to take this bark and we're just going to begin to shred it and process it down. And I'm just going to take the whole bundle and start to spread it out. If I've got some key pieces like this one that have really fine fibers in them, I'm going to set those aside. Because this right here is going to be my coarse and medium material. Looks like there might be a little bit of grapevine bark in there, so that's not going to hurt anything really. With this operation here, the bird nest portion of this, it's really key that you process this stuff up as good as you can. That's another big mistake I see with people. They work really hard to get that ember, and then they can't do anything with it because their material is just trash. And you want to kind of fold that into a bird nest, okay? You're trying to make a bird nest out of this thing. And if that thing don't look like something a bird would lay an egg in, it ain't good enough. Collect all them fine material, kind of save that to the side for a minute. Get that thing turned in, turned over, rolled up. So you got a good deep nest there. And it's nice and thick. That thing should be the size of a softball. Okay? Now we're going to take some of this material here and get as much bark off of it as we can and get it processed down, these fine fibers. I want some of these. I also want some of the finest stuff that I had on the ground here in this nest. So I'm going to put that stuff in there, that really fine stuff, and I'm going to set some of this aside for later because this is really, really highly combustible stuff here. And then I'm going to come in here and get the finest stuff that was on the ground and sprinkle that in the center of that nest, just like that. Okay, and we're going to set that aside. And that's how you construct a proper bird nest. Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road. Now we're going to take something, and this is just a sliver of our original material, and we're going to put it underneath our board for what we call a welcome mat, a place for that coal to collect and form. What I want to tell you before I start doing this is that the mistake I see a lot of people make is they go too fast, too fast. You don't need to go 100 miles an hour to get this to happen. What you need to do is remove material from this board and the spindle to accumulate in the notch, because that is your fuel for your fire. You'll then add heat to ignite that material. Without the material in the notch, the speed creating heat makes no difference whatsoever. You've got to create friction first and heat second. Okay, I went ahead and moved this set inside underneath this overhang a little further because of the wind outside. I wanted you to be able to see this without the wind blowing everything around at the same time we were doing it. So again, you know, we've got a welcome mat underneath here. So we've put a piece of bark underneath here, and that's our welcome mat. That's just a place to catch our ember so that it does not sit on the ground and absorb moisture. It also gives us a way to transfer the ember once it's coagulated into a bird's nest. Now, we're going to use exactly the same form that we used the last time around. And we're going to start off slow, because really all we want to do is build up material in this notch through friction. It doesn't matter how much speed we have to create heat until we have filled that notch with dust, because that's the material for our fire. Protect it from the wind a little bit, but you want the wind to get to that ember. At this point, you got plenty of time. Let's move this up. Still see our ember here. Sorry about that. Now we really just want to let that thing, matter of fact, I'm going to get this camera down here. We really just want to let that thing build up until we see it turn red on the top. So we got plenty of time to catch our breath and all that stuff while that's happening. Once we see that thing start to glow, then we can think about transferring that thing into our bird nest. The key is, get your bird nest as close to the ember as you can get it. Now you can see it's starting to glow right there. All right, so now I'm going to move this back up here. And we're going to gently pick this welcome mat up and gently tap that ember into our bird nest, and then let that thing build up a little bit. Again, and reposition. Okay? We want to fold our nest just a little bit and gently blow. Remember that heat rises. So blowing from underneath up is always going to be better. If you've got a big ember, you don't have to be in a hurry. There you go.